It looks like all of the usual suspects are here. I'm sure some will be joining us. Uh, Last time we looked at chapter 13 in Spong's book, and I hope you don't mind, but as I'm reading this book, there are some well, you might call annotations and commentary that I'm making that I want to alert you to, and maybe some of you know it already, but others may not. And but it has to do with this new type of theology, this mystical theology that we've been looking at. And I want to try to give you some historical markers along the way, just so you know that Spong just isn't talking off the top of his head about this new interpretation of Jesus. Jesus as part of this Merkabah mystical tradition. There is this underlying minority tradition in Christianity known generally as mysticism, but it also reaches a really, I think, vital culmination in the 19th and 20th century. And this is where the introduction of this theologian by the name of Paul Tillich becomes relevant to us. And I want to conclude today with a comparison of the 20th century and the first century with respect to what I will introduce as existential philosophy, because really what Spong is talking about and Jesus' response, well, actually, I should say Spong's argument as to what Jesus is trying to introduce, this new consciousness, has parallels in the 20th century to what many Christian existential philosophers were trying to do. So I hope you will, I hope it won't be too obscure, and I hope you will indulge me on that. But these are some just insights, revelations that I'm having as I'm reading Spong's book as well. But before we go on to chapter 14, is there anything anybody like to say about our previous reading? We just concluded with chapter 13. Any thoughts about that? I'm looking at all the faces. Oh, Lynn has joined us. By the way, hello, Constance and Sharon and Denny and Mac and everyone that I haven't said hello to. It's good to see you all. You might remember in chapter 13, Spong is doing what he will later do in the book that we just recently read on Matthew, and the book on biblical literalism. But he's placing Jesus in the context of some of the Jewish festivals. And it occurs to me that my name isn't Damon Heitman, so I'm going to change my name here. So future generations will know that I'm actually Dan Deffenbaugh, not Damon. But we looked at chapter 13 of Spong's book at chapter 6 of the Gospel of John, where Jesus is portrayed in the context of feeding the multitudes in the wilderness. And actually, we didn't really talk as much about the tag onto that, but remember the story of Moses. When Moses brings the people out of Egypt, and before they get into Mount Sinai, the people are complaining. Boy, we were doing so much better in the flesh pots of Egypt, and you brought us out here, and they were just being rather, just complaining about their state. And so Moses prays to God, and manna falls from heaven, and the people are able to eat it. And there's this wonderful commentary in Exodus, and when the story is told, is that they would gather manna every day. They would gather it up in the morning, but by the midday, the manna would disappear. And the commentary is made that those who had little did not have too little, and those who had much did not have too much. Already kind of giving some insight into the social, a movement towards social egalitarianism that you're going to find in this covenant that is going to later be introduced. The idea that, we're all in this together, and there might be some who have little, but they will not ever have too little. They will never be starving in poverty. There might be some who have too much, but it's never going to be too much. That's the ideal, right? It doesn't have to be this strict communism where everybody has the same thing, but tending towards a socialist idea that everybody has what is needed in order to survive and maybe even to enjoy life. So Jesus feeding the 5,000 is portrayed as a new Moses in this story. Also, you might remember that Moses demonstrates his or God's power over the elements. So you have bread, and then you have water in the parting of the Red Sea. This is when the journey begins, of course. And Jesus, in a similar fashion, demonstrates his power over the elements by meeting the disciples out on the Sea of Galilee, walking on the water. Now, here's the place that's so challenging, right? Because Spong wants to emphasize that these are not literal stories. And this is the place that if we had, I don't know, members from another, if we decided to take 5 or 6 members from one of the more evangelical churches in town, if we were to suggest what Spong is suggesting, that these stories never happened, that they need to be read symbolically. And this, of course, is a Jewish tradition. You tell allegorical tales that people are able to gain the moral of the tale, the outcome of why the tale is being told. The emphasis here is the fact that Jesus is a prophet who is at least as powerful as, or I don't want to say powerful, or is at least as I can't think of a good word, is at least as important in the Jewish tradition as Moses was, and even surpasses Moses in this respect. Like Moses, he has power over the elements. Try to tell that to people in some of our churches today, that the feeding of the 5,000 never happened, the walking on the water never happened. It's all meant to be taken symbolically, and the conversation is going to break down. So anyway, I'd like to stop and hear just how you're feeling about this, because we all have a tendency, just by virtue of living in the culture we live in, to read what we read in a very literal fashion. Ironically, this is an outgrowth of our scientific culture more than anything else. Have you had any, let's say, unsettling feelings about some of this? I will admit that I do, and I've known this for many, many years. Any thoughts or comments on this?
Dan?
Yeah, Danny.
Referencing back to a few minutes ago, the Israeli kibbutzim it seems to be is kind of a manifestation of what you're talking about in terms of the early ethos of the Israelites. The kibbutzim from, say, 1948 to the outbreak of the 67 war.
Right.
67 war changed everything.
Right. Yeah, those were those halcyon days of living the covenant in the desert once again, and springs of living water welling up from the ground, and manna falling from heaven, and everyone, those who have too little do not have too little, and those who have too much do not have too much, right? Everyone living in community according to the ideals of the covenant. And in the 67 war, you want to expand on that for those who don't know about the 67 war with, and the so-called 6-day war, I believe.
Right. that was a situation in which I believe 5 of the Arab states
Yeah,
launched a preemptive attack against Israel in 1967, maybe October,
yeah,
um, and were thoroughly defeated. This really wiped out the preoccupation with the Holocaust. Um,
yeah,
and, well, got to be careful on that one. Um, but it turned the Israeli state, you know, four square in the direction of national security, and
yeah,
you're really seeing that today.
yeah, exactly. And there might be a parallel there made between the time of the judges, where people were living in tribal, in clan, in their various tribes, the 12 tribes. And then what upset that was the danger from without, which came from the Philistines, especially Goliath, the giant, right? And another allegory here for the danger that these people living in these tribal communities felt when these sea-dwelling Philistines, who had a superior military power, started overwhelming them. So what do? They all congregate around a military leader, first Saul and then David, and then put all of their trust in, as they say, chariots and horses, right? Same thing happened, after that 6-day war, I would say. Very interestingly, the focus came to be upon, well, let's start building up our military, because we don't want these Philistines, so to speak, well, almost literally, Palestine, the Palestinians. We don't want these people overwhelming us. And that's where we remain today. So history repeats itself, interestingly. That's a wonderful, wonderful insight. And we could probably spend the rest of the hour just talking about what's happening in Israel. Do you want to make just one comment? I don't want to be the only one talking about this, Denny, but can I get your thoughts, or anyone else's thoughts, on what's happening with Netanyahu and his government now?
If anybody else wants to pitch in here, that's great. But in the last election, which finally installed Benjamin Netanyahu, I think, for prime minister for the 5th time.
Yeah.
The only coalition he could manage to pull together was of the ultra-right, ultra-Orthodox folks who have a very, very hard edge agenda.
Right.
And this may be, the fear is that Israel is becoming the new Turkey of Israel. Far more authoritarian, trying to, do to Israel, what, authoritarians in Hungary, for example. I'm seeing in the Israeli press right now, references to Viktor Orban in Hungary.
Right.
It is not pretty, and we were so lucky to be able to visit Israel and Palestine and the West Bank and the camps when we did some 3 years ago,
Right.
because I'm not sure that's going to be possible for some time.
Right. And of course, the losers in this are the Palestinians. Go ahead, Will.
Well, if it's okay to just add to what Denny said, and we were both, along with Ginny, lucky enough to be on that trip. And our bus driver was Palestinian Christian. Our guide was Palestinian Christian. But one of the takeaways from that was barbed wire and walls and checkpoints everywhere. And so it's no great shock to any of us. It's sad to observe what's happening today. The other thing is we were at the Sea of Galilee, and I remember reading the tactics that the Israelis used up on the Golan Heights with tanks. Isn't that right, Denny?
Yes,
And their tactics, it wasn't that they had numerical superiority, but they just simply used tactics and then encircled and took out. I think there were Syrian tanks. Is that right, Denny?
yes.
Syrian or Jordanian, but I think Syrian.
Yeah.
So we were lucky enough to have that good background, as Denny says, and I think he's right. I don't think we could do that trip today.
Yeah. But this also has ties to Christian evangelicalism and their support of Israel too, as having been, divinely ordained. But we can, I think we can talk about this, and it'll probably keep coming up in our discussion. But I do want to get into chapter 14 here, speaking of Moses and Jesus as the person who is the bread of life as well as living water. We're going to see he's already mentioned the idea of the bread of life, but now the living water is going to come appropriately at the feast of Sukkot. And this is where we get into chapter 14. Chapter 14 is actually, there's a lot of text. I hope you're reading along in the text. It makes it's kind of difficult. Spong doesn't really tell you I'm thinking about chapters this and verses here. As a whole, he gives us little, kind of references for like, John 6:13 or something like that. But chapter 14 of Spong's text corresponds to chapters 7 and 8 in the Gospel of John. And there's a lot of really, really interesting text there, especially one text that Spong doesn't even talk about at the beginning of chapter 8. And I'll try to mention that. But remember also the context here. We don't often think of context. And it's one of the unfortunate aspects of reading the Bible as we've often been taught to, in terms of, a verse here and a verse there. But this is a narrative that has a trajectory. And part of the trajectory is the geographical and cultural location of the story itself. Jesus is going to return. He's in Galilee at the beginning of chapter 7. And there is a kind of a parallel story to what happened in John chapter 2, when his mother was trying to force his hand, right? I want you to turn the water into wine, show people, what you are here for. Jesus has brothers. Now, we're not really sure historically if that's the case or who those brothers were, but in chapter 7, these brothers are saying, you're doing all these great things. You just walked on water. You need to go to Judea. And really, let's start this revolution. It almost as if to say, it appears that Jesus' brothers don't even know what he's all about. Most likely, they have a sense that Jesus is going to be one of these military messiahs that everybody was looking for. And Jesus says, no, my hour has not yet come. So we're dropping breadcrumbs. This is the same thing he said to his mother. Woman, what would you have me do? My hour has not yet come. But what we're seeing is that these breadcrumbs are leading towards the hour that will eventually come in what is referred to in John as Jesus' glorification. But the context here is really important, and Spong does a great job, as he did in our earlier text, which was actually written after this one, but he's kind of laying the groundwork for what he'd later write in the biblical literalism text. He makes a really strong argument about the importance of the festival to which Jesus is going. When he does decide to go to Jerusalem, not at the request of his brothers so much, but he's got his own reasons for going. He doesn't go in, he doesn't go with a fanfare and with a whole entourage, but he goes in secret. as if to say, he's not ready to bring a lot of attention yet to himself, even though eventually that's what happens. But he goes up during the Festival of Booths, also known as Sukkot. You might remember in our earlier discussion that the Jewish holy days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, it's a 10-day period of time, usually around September, late September, mid-September to into October, is later followed by the Feast of Sukkot. And Sukkot, even Spong calls the Jewish Thanksgiving, but it is that. It is a Thanksgiving ritual that involves a lot of ritual activities in Jerusalem, especially, where people circle the temple carrying these symbolic artifacts, you might say, these symbolic items. First of all, you have something called the lulav, which is a binding of these three trees or branches from three trees, one of them being a palm, the other a myrtle, the other a willow, representing, the abundance, the fecundity of the earth. And there is as well people carrying these, the citron, as it's referred to, called an etrog, very, very fragrant, especially if it's like a great big lemon, but I mean, very big, the size of sometimes these things can be the size of a small cantaloupe, you might say. But these are symbolic of God's, of giving thanks to God for the fecundity of the earth and for not only a good harvest, but for the perpetuation of a good harvest, the coming of rain, for the fertility of the land. And all of this being offered up to God in a kind of a salvation ritual. You have saved us, you have given us what feeds us, and we want to give thanks. And this is where the reading of Psalm 18 is so important. I just want to read part of it, and you will see that there's so much of this that still is part of our Christian worship. In fact, you might even be able to recite it, though you wouldn't even know where it's coming from. But it's going to be something that the author of the Gospel of John is going to try to draw upon in order to place Jesus in the context of one who is one with this God of fecundity. Now I'll say some more about that. So I'm reading chapter 1, or Psalm 118, verses 22 through 26. I thank you. Let me sit. Right. So this would be spoken around the temple while people are carrying their myrtle branches. This is the gate of the Lord, the righteous shall enter through it. I thank you that you have answered me and have become my salvation. In fact, that's what Jesus means. Yeshua, God is my salvation, my Redeemer. The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. This is the day that the Lord hath made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Save us, we beseech ye, O Lord. Literally, Hosanna, Hosanna. Save us, we beseech thee, O Lord. We beseech you, give us success. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. We bless you from the house of the Lord. The Lord is God, and he has given us light. Bind the festal procession with branches up to the horns of the altar. You are my God, and I will give thanks to you. You are my God, I will extol you. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Now, I would hazard a guess that about half of that you could almost recite in your head. the cornerstone reference there. And blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. This is part of the communion liturgy that we use in the church. Well, the writers of the Gospels, according to Spong, have in many ways tried to employ this imagery in their explanation of who Jesus was. I mean, it's seen most clearly, right, in the story of Jesus coming into Jerusalem for the Passover festival. But here people are laying down palms in front of him and saying, Hosanna, we beseech thee, glory to God in the highest, all of those things. But also the story of in Luke, where Jesus is on the road to Emmaus and he's meeting with two of the disciples, and they are telling him about, yeah, we thought this guy Jesus was going to be the Messiah. And eventually they come and they sit in a temporary dwelling and they break bread. When Jesus breaks the bread, their eyes are open and suddenly Jesus disappears. Some scholars, according to Spong, are saying that this is a reference or a symbolic reference to this festival in which people were building booths, literally. I mean, still to this day, in 2023, or in the last Sukkot, people build booths and they are required to have a meal outside under the stars, reminiscent of the wandering in the desert with Moses and the people who had just come from Egypt. So already we're looking at Jesus as one who previously has mentioned these other I am sayings. I am the bread of life. Remember what he said to the disciples when he walked on the water. It is I, but literally, I am. I am, All of this is clearly a reference to the name of God, which is revealed to Moses, Yahweh, though if you're a Jew, you wouldn't be able to say that. But Jesus has this intimate relationship with this God to the point where he and this God are one. So if he and this God are one, then it is to this God that we see in Jesus that we give our thanks for salvation, whether that salvation is eternal salvation or something much more tangible like the giving of water, the coming of the seasonal rains, the fertility, the earth, the crops that come out of the earth. So this is the context in which chapters 7 and 8 are going to be read. So do you remember that, I hope, from our earlier reading? Do you have any questions or comments about that? I propose that, in our congregational, maybe I should propose this to our congregational life committee, that in a kind of a tip of the hat to our Jewish heritage, whether we recognize it or not, we should have our own Sukkot celebration next fall. Let's build a booth out there in that playground area that used to be used for the kids, right? Let's have a meal, or put up a tent. But not many people know about Sukkot, but it is so important for is one of the festivals that lies in the background of Jesus and his life. Jesus does eventually go to Jerusalem, and there he begins teaching. And it's on the 8th day of Sukkot that his teaching really, comes forward. The teaching really culminates in a series of I am sayings. Again, the connection between Jesus and the God of Moses. But as he is drawing attention to himself, authorities are coming to him and saying, who do you think you are? Where are you coming from? Is this? And they have all these questions about him. Are you the Messiah? You can't possibly be the Messiah because, the scriptures say that, look how clearly literalists they are. The scriptures say that the Messiah is going to come out of Bethlehem, and you're from Galilee. I mean, what this can't possibly be the Messiah. So they're so caught into their literal thinking, well, looking at the scriptures as their proof text. So this man must be either demon possessed, but how in the world can this guy speak with such authority the way he does? And Jesus says to them, I don't speak on my own authority. In fact, let me read it for you. I'm not speaking on my own authority. So let me just start reading at chapter 7, verse 14. About the middle of the festival, Jesus went up into the temple and began to teach. The Jews were astonished at it, saying, how does this man have such learning when he has never been taught? Then Jesus answered them, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. Anyone who resolves to do the will of God will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own. Those who speak on their own seek their own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and there is nothing false in him. So it's a difficult thing to imagine. Jesus is immersed in the presence of God. So much so that Jesus consciousness is a God consciousness, not only consciousness of who God is, but what God's will is for the world. So the words that Jesus speaks are the words of God. And naturally, you can see how this gets caught up in, so you must be saying that you are God. And it's not quite the same thing, right? Jesus is the conduit through which God is speaking. His perfect God consciousness allows him to speak the words of God in a way that has such authority. But the authorities, they cannot accept this. And ultimately, Jesus is going to get himself even into more trouble when he very deliberately starts saying things that people are going to mistake like, he's claiming to be God himself, right? He's claiming to be all these things that we are associating with Yahweh. And that's where things get really kind of rough. And these are where the I am sayings once again come through. Now, I want to make sure that you know what I'm saying when I'm talking about the I am sayings. I am the bread of life. I am the vine, you are the branches. I am the light of the world. All of these things. These are tropes that run throughout the Gospel of John. And they are, like I say, breadcrumbs that lead us eventually to this glorification where the disciples, the apostles that Jesus has called, they don't quite realize what he's saying right now. But upon the glorification of Christ on the cross, they will look back. There's kind of this, what's called a hermeneutic of memory, and they will come to understand it more fully. Jesus and God are one, and that's why he can speak these I am sayings as he does. But the one that's really the most important, at least for me at this point, in the festival of Sukkot, it's on the 8th day when Jesus is speaking, and that is, the biggest day of Sukkot. Really begins in verse 12 of chapter 8. But let me just take a minute and mention something that Spong does not mention here. In the middle of these two chapters, chapter 7 and chapter 8, there is a story that's inserted that kind of breaks up the whole text altogether. And it's a story that many of us know so well, and it's a story of the woman who's caught in adultery. Let he who is sinless throw the first stone. And it just does not appear to have, been part of the flow of the story itself. So scholars have thought that what has happened here is that because this story in one form appears in Luke chapter 21, verses 37 and 38, that someone, an editor in maybe the Johannine community or maybe a later editor added this story for reasons that I don't know. I'm sure scholars have a reason for that. But when you take the story out, the woman caught in adultery, you see how these I am sayings and Jesus' teaching about himself and his association and his oneness with God flow perfectly. But the woman caught in adultery story just kind of, creates a syncopation in there that, kind of it's a little hiccup. So let's forget about that story. I shouldn't have even mentioned it, but I did want to point out how, scholarship, literary criticism can look at this and say, this wasn't a part of the original text. The woman caught adultery. It's obviously been borrowed from Luke, placed in here, and who knows why, but it was. So then Jesus begins with his sayings about who he is. And again, Jesus spoke to them saying, I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Then the Pharisees said to him, you are testifying on your own behalf. Your testimony is not valid. And Jesus answered, even if I testify on my own behalf, my testimony is valid because I know where I have come from and where I'm going. But you don't know where you come from or where I'm going. You don't know where I come from or where I'm going. You judge by human standards. I judge no one. Yet even if I do judge, my judgment is valid. For it is not I alone who judge, but I am the Father who sent me. Later on, actually earlier, Jesus also says, I am, oh gosh, I won't be able to find it. I am living water. Okay. Oh, here it is. On the last day of the festival, the great day, while Jesus was standing there, he cried out, let anyone who is thirsty come to me, and let the one who believes in me drink. As the scriptures have said, out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water. Now he said this about the Spirit, which he believes in him, which believers in him were to receive, for as yet there was no Spirit, because Jesus was not yet glorified. I'm looking for the place where it says, I'm living water. But anyway, these series of I am sayings are really indicative. Oh, Al is somehow skipped out of us. But the clash is clear. The Pharisees and Jesus, the Pharisees don't understand where Jesus is coming from simply because they can't put aside their traditionalism. And this is where Spong reaches the conclusion in his chapter. Jesus says, you must be free. If you know the truth, that will set you free. And the authorities are saying, hey, we're not in bondage to anybody. Why do we need to be free? And this is where Spong has his quote that I'll read for you here. The authorities deny that they themselves are not already free. And this is John 8:31 through 33. Forgetting their days of slavery in Egypt, they declare that they have never been in bondage to anyone. But Jesus is calling them to leave the bondage of assuming that in order to build themselves up, they must tear someone else down. Again, the Pharisees, the traditional Judaism of the day was defining themselves by who they were. They were who they were by virtue of who they were not. This exclusivism that we know about so well. Jesus argues that their security claims are rotted. I don't. That's not the right word. Are rotted. Not in the stat. I've somehow messed this up, but
I think it's rooted.
Oh, rooted. Okay. Okay. Thanks. Jesus argues that their security claims are rooted not in the status as descendants of Abraham, but in their unwillingness to do what Abraham did. And here's the important thing. Abraham left the world he knew in Ur of the Chaldees to venture forth into the unknown world of becoming all that he could be. All that he could be. Abraham stepped out of the security of the known He walked beyond the certainty of religion in order to enter the insecurity of expanding faith in a frightening world. So this is what Jesus, I'm hearing ringing. I don't know why that's happening, but this is what's happening with Jesus, is that this new consciousness that he's bringing requires people to take, as Kierkegaard said, a leap of faith away from their tradition and the way that they normally fall back on all of their laws, rules, and their regulations, and to enter a life of vulnerability and insecurity. And this is the place, if you all indulge me, that I was hoping to be able to get to. This is the place that I wanted to talk a little bit about existentialism. Because what Spong is talking about here is really recognizing the existential angst that we all have as human beings. Now, it really boils down to this. Human beings are being placed in this really highly vulnerable situation where we can imagine ourselves as being unique, completely unique in the world, and perhaps even immortal, living forever, right? We can imagine ourselves living forever. But deep down, we know that ultimately we're going to die, that death awaits us. And that is a very, very vulnerable and unsettling situation. And this is at the core of what it means to be human in the modern world. But it's not really terribly modern, because there's a connection with what we're talking about in the first century as well. What the Jews like to do was to wrap themselves in their law, in the certainty of Moses, and the certainty of their descendants, having descended from Abraham, and assume that all is well. And what it does, it places blinders on them so that they don't see the true reality of their human situation. Ultimately, we are all very vulnerable beings. Ultimately, we are dependent upon God, regardless of the laws and the rules and everything that we believe and that keeps us safe. This was something called existentialism that grew out of the 19th century. And I wish we could spend a little bit more time on this, but Spong is really claiming here that Jesus is kind of an existential prophet. He is calling people to realize their utter dependence upon God. This is the new consciousness of which Jesus is speaking. This is the new consciousness that he's drawing people out of the old religion and into the new. But let's just define existentialism as it was defined in the 20th century. And so I wrote up this little piece. I hope it's short and brief enough. But existentialism is a philosophical movement that grew out of human experiences in Europe during the 19th century. It was a response to the scientific and industrial revolutions and to some aspects of Enlightenment philosophy, all of which challenged the notion of human exceptionalism and the cherished truths of the past centuries espoused by the church. Industrial revolution, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment that really challenged the idea that there was a God at all of those things really kind of shook the foundations of everything that people relied upon in the 19th century. Think about the wars in the mid-19th century in Europe that, were just atrocious in terms of their, the destruction of cities and cultures and human beings. Think about the impersonality or the way the Industrial Revolution just turned human beings into cogs into a machine. This was the world that challenged the idea that somehow human beings were, beloved of God, for example, or had some sort of exceptionalism. Back to my quote here. In its most pessimistic proclamation, this is one penned by Friedrich Nietzsche. Existentialism is defined by the idea that God is dead and we have killed him. Must not we ourselves become gods to be worthy of such a task? So some existentialism is atheistic. There is no God. Why would a God make all of this happen, right? Well, think of the atom bomb. Think of the atrocities of World War I. Think of everything that that we have to deal with on a daily basis, right? But there were others. There were, however, Christians like Soren Kierkegaard and later Paul Tillich, who rose to the challenge of reconfiguring the Christian message to address the growing sense of anxiety and thrownness of modern men and women. And Spong has clearly been influenced by this tradition. When I say thrownness, this is something that a philosopher by the name of Martin Heidegger said. All of us have this sense that we've just been thrown into this world, that there is no, destiny that we've been given. There is no essence to ourselves, that we're just kind of these haphazard beings that have been, and this is the despair of the 19th and 20th century. But in the midst of that despair, there can be hope. And this is what Spong is trying to say about Jesus' message. Forget about all of the Jewish laws that you cling to and hold to with such faith. They're ways that they're keeping you from recognizing your the true human condition. Ultimately, faith has to be in your ground of being, who is God, and everything else just gets in the way of that. Your laws, your rituals, all of those things that you hold so strongly to. So what I'm saying here, and I'm going rather quickly, I'd really love to spend more time on this. What I'm saying here is that in the 20th century, there was something known as crisis theology. After Darwin's theory of evolution, after Freud explained human psychology, in his reductionistic way, after Nietzsche claiming God is dead, after our experience of all the technologies of destruction that we, experienced in World War I and industrialization, there were two basic responses. One of those was to fall back on evangelical theology of the creeds of the church and through people like Karl Barth, a very, very traditional response. And don't get me wrong, I'm a big Barth fan as well, but Barth really didn't. Barth's response to the existential dilemma was quite different from that of Tillich. Tillich, on the other hand, was one who said, embrace who we are. This is the human situation and has been the human situation all along. We are vulnerable beings. There are no absolutes that we can hold fast to. We are in a very, very precarious situation. Thus, our faith needs to be an act of courage. Faith is courage. There are no guarantees, but nevertheless, there is this courage that is grounded in our sense of being one with God, that God is at the foundation of who we are. This is very, very similar to what was happening in the first century. If you were a Jew in the first century, look at everything that created this situation of crisis, you might say. The Hellenization that began with Alexander the Great, when Jews were assimilated or tried to be assimilated into Greek culture. Roman imperialism, where Romans were occupying the Holy Land, and the threat of cultural assimilation, all happening. All of the old standards, all of the old truths were breaking apart. Apocalypticism, messianism. And there were two responses to this. One of those was the response of the synagogue, represented in the Gospel of John by the authorities, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? But the other was this new existential understanding that, Jesus is bringing a new consciousness that transcends barriers. Yes, we are living in a crisis situation, but the response is not to build walls, but to break them down, to recognize the unity that we all have in this. The parallel seems to be so clear to me. And we're still in the midst of this. Look at where we are in terms of issues like diversity. I mean, look at what Governor DeSantis is doing with education in Florida. That's a response of the Pharisees, right? No, we're gonna fall back on the way things were. We're gonna teach Western civilization. We're not gonna teach any of this, critical race theory, for example. But the other approach is to recognize this shared humanity that we all have. And so this is the response that I think, or this is the orientation that Spong is trying to say Jesus is displaying here. So I'm going really fast because I wanted to get through that as quickly as I could. I hope I haven't lost a lot of you. Can I ask for any kind of response? Anybody have a comment or two?
Dan, I'll take a stab at something here. Because there's a lot to unpack here, I think.
Oh, I know. 20 minutes.
It makes you wonder if Spong thinks that John, who would be all by himself, has sort of an understanding of the existential perspective. Because I want to refer back to a book I referenced earlier, The Five Gospels. And basically it's the work of the Jesus Seminar, of which Spong was a member. But the Jesus Seminar covered a wide range of scholars, and their goal was to remind everybody to determine the historicity of, in volume 1, the sayings, and in volume 2, the acts of Jesus. And we just concluded today with all of these sayings of Jesus. The Five Gospels, that's the one that's color coded.
Right.
It's red if it's probably said it, pink if he could have,
Right,
gray,
right.
who knows, and black if he definitely didn't. And the Gospel of John is almost solid black.
Yeah.
So all of these sayings we're talking about, at least there's a wide range of scholarship that would maintain that he didn't say any of it. And it's consistent with Spong's view of the Sermon on the Mount, that Jesus didn't say that the author of the gospel wrote it. And I assume that that's his take here.
Mm-hmm.
It's attractive to Spong because of that existential take.
Right.
But as I recall, in reviewing my Tillich book again a little bit on some of the notes, that that and you mentioned Barth and Tillich. Barth more emphasized what I learned as they call the kerygma, the
Right.
earliest fundamental beliefs of the church, and they were literalist. I mean, they believed, again, that's the Jewish way. When they say resurrection, they meant a bodily resurrection.
Right.
And Tillich and Spong both see this is like symbolic. And so the question I think that was raised, is it fair to say that the early followers of Jesus could view a lot of things symbolically? Maybe John did, certainly Spong does.
Yeah.
And interesting, I wrote this down, I don't know, but they said, Rudolf Bultmann, and when I took contemporary theology, they were the big three: Bultmann, Tillich, and Barth. Okay.
Yeah.
And that question, could the early followers of Jesus view the resurrection as a symbol? Bultmann says, oh, sure, they could. And Barth says no.
Mm-hmm.
And Tillich says basically the early ones didn't understand it symbolically, but we've got it right.
Yeah.
We've got it right. And he's obviously been he thinks, I think he thinks, and that's what I'm I guess if I have a question, that is my question.
Yeah.
It's kind of his view that John has it right,
Mhm.
alone among the gospel writers and even Paul.
Yeah, right, right. Correct. Yeah, and he even mentions he's got that little tip of the hat to how incomplete Paul was when we looked at the first couple of chapters of this book. That's a good characterization of Bultmann and Tillich, and that is Bultmann. He believed that the mythology was clearly, and I don't know where I come down on that. I think I'm more of a Bultmann person in that respect. I think the people could understand the symbolic nature because of, their Jewish background. When you heard Jewish sermons, especially, explications of the Torah that were being spoken in the synagogue, and you were speaking mostly to peasants who were illiterate, the way you would teach would be by allegories and parables and things like that. So I don't know. It's an open question. But I'm still a Tillich person. I do like Tillich a lot. But I think, he's really difficult for us at this point to understand because, ever since the 1980s with the whole evangelical literalist movement, even people who are progressive Christians can't imagine reading the Bible in any other way other than in a literalist way. And so what we're doing here is difficult in some ways. And that's why I want to kind of keep my finger on the pulse of how you're all feeling. And if you're thinking, no, I can't accept this, I think Jesus fed 5,000, I would love to know it. I don't want to tell you you're wrong. I can't say that. But I know it must be making some of us feel very uncomfortable, but that's all a part of the plan, right? There is a discomfort. There is fear and trembling that takes place in the leap of faith that we're talking about here. There are no absolutes. There are no easy answers. Even though as human beings, that's what we want. So anybody else have a comment about this? Well, I wish I could have spent a little more time on this. I know I don't want to spend the entire year just on this book, but there are so many connections that I'm finding that I want to at least talk about, and maybe you can find points of contact with as well. But this crisis theology comes out of the 19th and 20th century in the sense that human beings are kind of lost in the universe, that there may not be a God and all of those things. It's a shaking of the foundations that nevertheless, in the midst of, there can be a faith that is vital. And this is what Tillich was saying in the 20th century. And I think this is really what Spong believes Jesus was saying in the first century. So hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit more next time. I feel like I rushed through a lot today, but there's always next time. So anybody else have a final statement? Question? Well, thank you. And I will see you all next Wednesday. Oh, and by the way, I'm teaching Sunday school class. I don't know how well this is going to go, but I'm going to do a series during Lent on the creeds of the church, the confessions of the church. And so we'll start historically with, some of the early confessions we see in the Bible, going all the way up to the Barmen Declaration. And yeah, I think that's where I'm ending. So just so you know, tell your friends, tell your neighbors. If you ever want to learn more about the boring confessions of the church, I'll try to make it less boring than might typically be the case. So I'll see you all next Wednesday, and we'll look at chapter 15 next Wednesday. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank
Bye.
you.